Does anyone here know how to fly this aircraft? Commander Daniel Brooks's voice cut through the operations center with an urgency that silenced every conversation. The giant digital mission clock continued its relentless countdown, each red number stealing another second from an operation planned over 6 months. Rain swept across the flight line outside while a classified helicopter sat beneath glaring floodlights, fully prepared except for one critical detail. It had no qualified pilot. Around the command table stood Navy SEAL operators, aviation officers, intelligence analysts, and maintenance specialists. Every face reflected the same uncomfortable truth. The aircraft belonged to a restricted program that only a handful of pilots had ever touched. One by one, experienced aviators admitted they lacked the required certification. One had studied the platform years ago. Another had logged hundreds of hours in conventional helicopters but never this one. A third quietly suggested delaying the mission before lowering his eyes, already knowing that delay would likely end it. Radios crackled. Weather officers warned the departure window was shrinking. Mechanics continued running checklists because stopping would mean accepting failure before the final decision had even been made. Amid the growing tension, a young logistics lieutenant noticed a woman sitting quietly beside a supply cabinet. She wore the same camouflage uniform as everyone else. Her blonde hair rested in a regulation bun, and a paper cup of black coffee sat untouched in her hands. No colorful patches decorated her sleeves. No collection of impressive badges drew attention. She looked more like someone assigned to administrative support than someone involved in classified flight operations. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said politely as he hurried over with several mission folders, "would you mind organizing these? We are running out of people." "Of course," she replied with a calm smile. Without hesitation, she aligned the folders by mission number while the room continued searching for answers elsewhere. Nobody questioned why she had clearance to remain inside one of the most restricted briefings on the base. Nobody noticed that her eyes briefly settled on the aircraft blueprint projected across the operations screen. They also failed to notice the faint expression of recognition that crossed her face before disappearing just as quickly. Commander Brooks paced toward the display, frustration beginning to show despite years of disciplined leadership. "There has to be someone," he said quietly. "Somebody in this room has seen this platform before." Silence answered him again. The mission clock dropped below 7 minutes. Across the room, another officer glanced toward the woman near the cabinet before dismissing her with a shrug. "She is probably here for paperwork," he muttered. "We need pilots, not clerks." A few tired smiles appeared around the room, more from stress than humor. The woman simply continued arranging the folders without looking up. She did not defend herself. She did not interrupt the discussion. She only listened. Outside, thunder rolled across the airfield as the helicopter waited beneath sheets of rain. Inside, the answer everyone desperately needed had already been sitting among them from the very beginning, quietly allowing every assumption in the room to reveal itself before she ever spoke a single word. Commander Daniel Brooks studied the shrinking countdown with growing concern. Every passing second carried the weight of months of planning, intelligence gathering, and coordination between multiple units. The mission itself remained classified, but everyone inside the operations center understood its importance. Failure was not simply an inconvenience. It meant losing an opportunity that might never return. The weather officer stepped closer to the command table and quietly cleared his throat. "Sir, we have less than 6 minutes before the crosswinds exceed the operational limit." Brooks nodded without answering. His attention remained fixed on the room, searching every uniform for confidence instead of uncertainty. None appeared. The helicopter displayed on the operations screen represented one of the military's most closely guarded aviation programs. Its advanced navigation systems, specialized flight controls, and unique mission profile required qualifications possessed by only a handful of pilots across the country. Calling one from another installation was impossible. Time had already run out. Across the room, the young lieutenant returned to collect the folders from the quiet woman beside the supply cabinet. Thank you, he said with an appreciative smile before adding almost absent-mindedly, the administrative staff has been saving us all morning. She simply handed him the perfectly organized stack. Glad I could help. He hurried away without realizing that she had never claimed to be administrative personnel. Nearby, two experienced operators exchanged frustrated whispers. If nobody here can fly it, headquarters should cancel the mission. Headquarters is not going to cancel anything, the other replied. They will expect us to find a solution. Their conversation drifted across the room while the woman quietly watched the classified aircraft blueprint glowing on the wall. Her gaze lingered on a small technical detail near the cockpit layout before she looked away again. Commander Brooks suddenly stopped pacing. Has anyone here ever even seen this aircraft in person? A senior aviator slowly raised his hand before lowering it again. Only during a security briefing years ago, sir. I never touched the controls. Another officer shook his head. Same here. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain pounding against the windows. Brooks exhaled slowly, disappointment beginning to replace urgency. Then one maintenance chief spoke up. Sir, whoever certified on this platform would recognize that cockpit immediately. Brooks looked toward the large projection once more. His eyes followed the maintenance chief's observation, then drifted almost by accident toward the quiet woman standing near the cabinet. She happened to be looking at the same image with calm familiarity before lowering her eyes as though nothing had happened. Brooks frowned for only a moment. Something about her expression seemed strangely out of place, but another radio transmission immediately pulled his attention away. Commander, the communications officer called, mission launch window is now under 5 minutes. Brooks straightened his shoulders. One final time, he announced, his voice carrying across the operations center. If anyone in this room has experience with this aircraft, speak now. No rank. No embarrassment. We need the truth. The room remained completely silent. Only the rain answered him, while the quiet woman slowly placed her empty coffee cup onto the table and looked toward the helicopter for one brief, thoughtful moment. Commander Daniel Brooks let the silence linger for another second before turning toward the operations display again. Every instinct told him the answer had to exist somewhere inside the room, but experience had also taught him that hesitation often carried its own message. No one wanted to claim qualifications they did not possess, especially with dozens of elite operators depending on a single decision. The communications officer stepped forward once more. Sir, satellite confirmation just came through. The ground team is in position. They are waiting for launch authorization. Brooks nodded slowly. Tell them to hold. That is all we can give them. Yes, sir. Around the command table, conversations resumed in low voices. Suggestions came and went without solving the problem. One officer proposed sending another aircraft. Another immediately rejected the idea because the classified cargo could only be transported by the helicopter sitting outside. The maintenance chief folded his arms. Everything is ready except the pilot. Fuel is loaded. Systems are green. We are literally waiting on one person. Across the room, the quiet woman remained standing beside the supply cabinet. She watched the discussion unfold with the same composed expression she had worn since the briefing began. Her attention drifted toward the weather monitor, then to the mission map, before returning to the aircraft blueprint. Her eyes paused on a small caution indicator that nobody else seemed to notice. That display is still using the older navigation configuration, she murmured almost to herself. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the maintenance chief happened to hear it. He looked toward her with mild curiosity. What did you say? She met his eyes for a brief moment. Nothing important. Before he could ask another question, another officer interrupted. Commander, we have less than 4 minutes. Brooks rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the pressure of every pair of eyes in the room. Then he made a decision. Contact headquarters one last time. Ask whether anyone certified on Project Raven is within immediate flight distance. The communications officer hesitated. Sir, we already received that answer. Brooks closed his eyes for a brief second. I know. The room grew quiet again. Outside, lightning flashed beyond the runway, briefly illuminating the waiting helicopter. Inside, the woman picked up her empty coffee cup and walked toward the recycling bin. As she passed the operations screen, she glanced at the cockpit schematic once more. This time, she stopped for less than a second before calmly speaking without turning around. If you start the auxiliary flight computer before the primary navigation system finishes calibrating, the aircraft will lock itself into maintenance mode for exactly 3 minutes. Every conversation stopped. Several officers slowly turned toward her. The maintenance chief frowned. That procedure is classified. The woman looked back with quiet composure. Yes, she answered softly. It is. The maintenance chief stared at her for several seconds before breaking the silence. How do you know that? His voice carried neither anger nor accusation, only genuine confusion. The woman looked from him to the operations screen, then quietly set her empty coffee cup on the nearest table. Because that safeguard was added after the second evaluation cycle, she replied. The original software did not have it. Several officers exchanged puzzled looks. One aviation lieutenant frowned. That information is not in the current technical manuals. No, she answered calmly. It is not. Commander Brooks slowly stepped away from the command table. His years of experience had taught him to recognize confidence that came from knowledge rather than ego. The woman standing before him showed none of the nervousness he had watched spread through the room during the last 10 minutes. She had not interrupted anyone, never demanded attention, and never claimed she had the solution. Yet the small detail she had mentioned was precise enough to make even the maintenance chief reconsider everything he thought he knew. Brooks stopped a few feet away. Lieutenant, he said evenly, your name? Emily Carter, sir. Current assignment? Special Operations Aviation Liaison. A few eyebrows immediately lifted around the room. The title sounded familiar, but nobody present could remember seeing her attached to the operation. Brooks narrowed his eyes. That assignment alone does not explain your knowledge of Project Raven. Emily nodded once. No, sir. Before Brooks could continue, the communications officer interrupted again. Commander, launch window is now under 3 minutes. The reminder pulled every eye back toward the countdown clock. 3 minutes. Brooks looked at Emily again. Can you fly that aircraft? The question hung over the operations center with remarkable weight. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a radio. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the rain-covered runway visible through the operations center windows. The classified helicopter waited exactly where it had been since the briefing began, its navigation lights glowing softly against the darkness. She seemed to study the weather more than the aircraft itself before finally speaking. Yes, sir. The response was quiet, almost gentle, yet every person in the room heard it clearly. One young officer let out a short laugh of disbelief before quickly stopping himself. Another pilot folded his arms. With respect, Commander, we cannot hand over a classified platform because someone says yes. Emily showed no reaction to the skepticism. Brooks did not either. Fair point, he said. Ms. Carter, if you are certified, prove it. Emily turned toward the operations display. Without asking for permission, she picked up the digital stylus resting beside the screen and highlighted 3 indicators inside the cockpit layout. Before engine start, the aircraft performs an encrypted synchronization sequence lasting 47 seconds, she began. If the left avionics bus shows an amber status during that sequence, the backup inertial reference must remain isolated until the synchronization completes. If anyone resets it early, the aircraft refuses navigation authority and the entire startup process begins again. The maintenance chief slowly lowered the clipboard in his hands. No one had spoken those procedures aloud in years. Brooks watched his expression change first, then looked back at Emily. For the first time since the emergency began, hope quietly entered the room. Brooks did not celebrate too early. Experience had taught him that impressive technical knowledge was not the same as proven qualification. He folded his arms and held Emily's gaze for another long moment. "Anyone can memorize procedures," he said evenly. "Tell me something that is not written anywhere." Emily nodded as if she had expected the question. She tapped the lower corner of the cockpit diagram. The aircraft develops a slight vibration during climb between 900 and 1,000 feet whenever the external temperature falls below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The engineers spent months trying to eliminate it before discovering it was harmless. Most pilots never noticed because they instinctively corrected with the pedals. The maintenance chief's eyes widened. That issue was never documented. Emily gave a faint smile. No. It was corrected through pilot familiarization instead. A heavy silence settled over the room again. This time it felt different. Doubt was slowly giving way to curiosity. The senior aviator who had admitted earlier that he had only seen the helicopter during a classified briefing stepped closer to Brooks. "Sir. I attended the acceptance conference 6 years ago. She is right. I remember the engineers arguing about that vibration." Brooks looked back toward Emily. "How many hours?" "Just over 400 on the platform, sir." Several officers exchanged stunned looks. "Impossible," one whispered. Emily heard him but ignored the comment. Brooks continued. "Last flight. 14 months ago during the final operational evaluation before reassignment. Call sign. Falcon 7. The commander remained silent. Then, without warning, he walked to the secure operations console and entered a classified authorization code. The system requested an additional verification before displaying a restricted personnel database. Brooks typed Emily Carter's name. For a brief second nothing appeared. Then the screen refreshed. A red security banner filled the monitor, followed by a clearance warning that forced everyone nearby to step back instinctively. Access level restricted. Project Raven flight status. Primary evaluation pilot. Brooks stared at the display in disbelief. The database continued scrolling. Test pilot. Instructor. Flight evaluator. Mission certification authority. 423 verified flight hours. 0 mission failures. Final evaluation rating, exceptional. The commander slowly looked up from the screen. Around him, every conversation had stopped. Even the communications equipment seemed strangely quiet. The young lieutenant who had asked Emily to organize paperwork moments earlier felt the color drain from his face. The pilot who had questioned her credentials lowered his eyes without saying a word. Brooks stepped away from the console and came to attention almost instinctively. "Ms. Carter," he began before correcting himself. "Commander Carter." Emily remained exactly where she was. "Permission to launch the aircraft, sir." Brooks did not hesitate this time. He nodded once. "Permission granted." As Emily turned toward the exit leading to the rain-soaked flight line, every operator in the room instinctively moved aside, creating a clear path without a single order being given. Only after she disappeared through the secure door did anyone finally realize that the quiet woman they had mistaken for administrative support had never once asked for respect. She had simply waited until competence spoke louder than assumptions ever could. Commander Brooks watched the secure door close behind Emily before turning toward the stunned officers surrounding him. Nobody spoke. The same room that had been filled with hurried conversations only moments earlier now stood in complete silence. Finally, the maintenance chief cleared his throat. "Sir, she was one of the original Project Raven evaluation pilots." Brooks never took his eyes off the security display. Not one of them. He paused briefly. The lead evaluator. The words landed heavily across the operations center. The young lieutenant who had mistaken Emily for administrative support slowly removed the folders from under his arm, replaying every conversation he had shared with her that morning. She had never corrected him. She had never reminded him of her qualifications. She had simply helped without hesitation. I asked her to organize paperwork, he muttered quietly. The senior aviator placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. She organized the paperwork because it needed to be done. Outside, rain continued falling steadily across the runway as Emily crossed the flight line with calm, measured steps. Ground crews immediately noticed her approaching the classified helicopter. One crew chief looked around in confusion before calling over the headset, "Commander, we have someone approaching Raven 1. Brooks answered instantly. "Stand by. She is your pilot." The crew chief blinked in surprise but wasted no time. "Copy that." As Emily reached the aircraft, the technicians instinctively straightened their posture. None of them had met her before, yet something about the confidence in her movements quietly erased every question. She ran her fingertips across the side of the helicopter for a brief moment before beginning the exterior inspection. Every step followed a precise rhythm, neither rushed nor theatrical. One mechanic watched with growing curiosity. "She is checking areas nobody else looks at," he whispered. Another nodded. "Those are the old inspection points from the prototype models." Inside the operations center, Brooks continued reviewing Emily's classified service record. New lines appeared as additional authorization unlocked. Flight test instructor. Emergency systems consultant. Operational procedures review board. Several commendations remained completely redacted. The commander slowly leaned back in his chair. During his career he had worked beside decorated pilots, respected instructors, and experienced test crews, yet he had never heard Emily Carter's name mentioned. "How is that possible?" he asked quietly. The intelligence officer standing nearby answered without looking away from the classified file. "Project Raven personnel operated under compartmentalized identities, sir. Even senior command only received information on a need-to-know basis." Brooks gave a slow nod. Everything suddenly made sense. Emily had not been overlooked by accident. She had spent years inside a program designed to leave almost no public trace of the people involved. Her greatest achievements existed inside classified files that very few people could even access. A moment later, the communications headset crackled again. "Commander, Raven 1 reports pilot aboard." Brooks reached for the microphone. "Status?" The response came back immediately. "Engine start sequence initiated." Every person inside the operations center instinctively turned toward the large observation windows overlooking the rain-soaked runway. The mission clock continued counting down, but for the first time that morning, nobody was watching the clock anymore. Every eye was fixed on the helicopter, waiting to see whether the quiet woman they had underestimated was about to prove that sometimes the most extraordinary professionals were the ones who never felt the need to announce who they were. The engines awakened with a smooth, restrained hum that barely rose above the sound of the rain. Several younger technicians exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected the familiar sequence described in their training manuals, but Emily's hands moved with quiet confidence through a series of deliberate inputs that seemed almost effortless. She paused only once, watching the instrument panel with complete focus before gently adjusting a single control. The amber indicator disappeared exactly as the maintenance chief had predicted it would. "Engine parameters are perfect," the crew chief reported into his headset, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. "Hydraulics normal. Navigation systems synchronizing." Inside the operations center, Commander Brooks listened without interrupting. The maintenance chief folded his arms, watching every telemetry feed appear across the large display. "She skipped nothing," he murmured. "Every check is exactly where it should be." Brooks nodded. That is what experience looks like. Moments later another transmission arrived. Commander, Raven 1 is requesting taxi authorization. Brooks reached for the microphone without hesitation. Raven 1, taxi approved. Mission authorization remains active. Copy that, Emily answered calmly over the secure channel. It was the first time many people inside the room had heard her voice through military communications. There was no excitement, no attempt to impress anyone, only the steady tone of someone completely comfortable with responsibility. The helicopter began rolling across the rain-covered taxiway with remarkable precision. Even before reaching the runway, one of the veteran mechanics quietly smiled. "Watch the turns," he said to the younger technicians. "No unnecessary corrections." They watched carefully as the aircraft followed the centerline with almost mechanical accuracy. "She makes it look easy," one whispered. "That is because she is not fighting the aircraft," the mechanic replied. "She understands it." Commander Brooks continued monitoring every system update while the intelligence officer reviewed the mission timeline. "We are back inside the departure window," she reported. "Barely, but we made it." Brooks allowed himself a slow breath for the first time that morning. Around the room, the same officers who had searched desperately for a qualified pilot only minutes earlier now watched in respectful silence. Nobody mentioned the paperwork Emily had organized. Nobody joked about administrative duties anymore. Their assumptions had disappeared without a single argument. They had been replaced by something much stronger than embarrassment. They had been replaced by respect. The communications officer adjusted his headset. "Commander, Raven 1 is holding short of the runway." Brooks picked up the microphone one final time. "Raven 1, you are cleared for departure. Good luck." A brief pause followed before Emily answered. "Thank you, sir. Bringing everyone home starts now." As the transmission ended, the helicopter accelerated smoothly into the darkness beyond the floodlights, disappearing into the rain with quiet confidence. No applause filled the operations center. No dramatic celebration broke the silence. Instead, every soldier, aviator, technician, and officer simply stood watching the empty runway, each one carrying the same lesson away from that morning. The quietest person in the room had never needed to prove who she was. She only needed the right moment for her actions to speak louder than every assumption made before she ever stood up. Emily guided Raven 1 through the storm with the same quiet precision that had defined every movement since she entered the operations center. Rain streamed across the cockpit canopy while the helicopter climbed above the cloud layer into clear night skies. Inside the aircraft, the advanced flight systems synchronized exactly as they had during hundreds of evaluation flights years earlier. Every indicator settled into the expected range. Every response matched her memory. Back at the base, Commander Brooks remained beside the operations display as a new stream of encrypted telemetry appeared across the screen. The intelligence officer compared each update against the mission timeline before allowing herself a small smile. "She is ahead of schedule," she reported. Brooks glanced toward the maintenance chief. "How unusual is that?" The older man chuckled quietly. "For anyone else? Very unusual. For the person who helped write the flight procedures? Probably normal." Several younger officers exchanged embarrassed smiles. Earlier that morning they had searched desperately for someone capable of flying the aircraft while the most qualified person had been sitting only a few feet away. None of them could change that now, but every one of them had learned something far more valuable than another technical lesson. Respect could not be measured by appearance, rank patches, or loud confidence. It had to be earned through competence. Hundreds of miles away, the ground team received confirmation that Raven 1 had entered the designated corridor. A secure radio transmission reached the cockpit. "Raven 1, this is Echo Team. We have visual confirmation. Your timing is perfect." Emily acknowledged the call with calm professionalism. "Copy, Echo Team. Beginning final approach." The landing zone had been selected months earlier because it offered the safest access to the objective while remaining hidden from ordinary air traffic. Even so, unpredictable mountain winds demanded constant attention. Emily adjusted the collective slightly, feeling the aircraft respond with smooth confidence. The helicopter seemed less like a machine and more like a trusted partner she understood completely. Minutes later, the landing gear touched the ground so gently that one operator inside the cabin looked toward another and quietly laughed. "Did we already land?" The team leader smiled beneath his helmet. "Apparently we did." The operators quickly exited the aircraft and disappeared into the darkness to complete their assignment. Emily remained focused on her instruments, monitoring engine performance and weather conditions while waiting for their return. She knew the most important responsibility of any pilot was not delivering a team into danger. It was bringing them home safely afterward. Nearly an hour passed before the secure radio came alive again. "Echo team to Raven 1. Mission complete. Returning now." "Copy," Emily answered. "Landing zone secure." Within minutes the operators reappeared through the darkness and boarded the helicopter with disciplined efficiency. The team leader settled into his seat before looking toward the cockpit. "Pilot," he called, "whoever you are, thank you." Emily smiled quietly without turning around. "Happy to help." Moments later Raven 1 lifted smoothly into the night sky for the journey home while, back at the operations center, Commander Brooks watched the tracking symbol begin its return across the digital map. Only then did he realize the greatest lesson of the day had never been about a classified helicopter. It had been about how easily extraordinary people could be overlooked when everyone was too busy judging what they thought they already knew. Emily guided Raven 1 through the final stretch of its return flight while the first light of dawn slowly appeared along the distant horizon. The storm that had threatened the mission only hours earlier was beginning to weaken, leaving scattered clouds drifting above the mountains. Inside the cockpit, every instrument continued operating exactly as expected. The advanced flight systems responded with quiet precision, and the helicopter seemed almost effortless to control in experienced hands. Behind her, the SEAL operators remained unusually quiet. They had completed their objective successfully, yet their thoughts kept returning to the calm pilot who had appeared at exactly the right moment. One operator finally leaned toward the team leader and whispered, "Did you know who she was before today?" The team leader shook his head. "No. But I know one thing now." "What is that?" "The best people rarely introduce themselves." The cabin fell silent again. Back at the operations center, Commander Brooks continued following the encrypted flight path displayed across the large screen. The tension that had filled the room earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by quiet reflection. The young lieutenant who had mistaken Emily for administrative support stood near the command table, replaying every moment from that morning. "Commander," he said carefully, "she never corrected me." Brooks looked toward him. "No, she could have." "She could have," Brooks agreed. "Instead, she chose to help where help was needed." The lieutenant lowered his eyes for a moment. "I judged her before I knew anything about her." Brooks gave a faint nod. "That happens more often than people like to admit." Several officers nearby listened without interrupting. None of them felt the need to defend their earlier assumptions. The events of the morning had already spoken more clearly than any lecture could. A short time later, the communications officer smiled as another secure transmission appeared. "Commander, Raven 1 is entering home airspace." Brooks reached for the microphone. "Welcome back, Raven 1. Emily's familiar voice answered almost immediately. "Thank you, sir. Requesting landing clearance. Runway is yours." As the helicopter approached the base, ground crews gathered near the landing area. Word had quietly spread through maintenance, aviation, and special operations that the mysterious pilot was returning. Nobody gathered out of curiosity alone. They gathered out of respect. Raven 1 settled gently onto the landing pad with remarkable smoothness. The rotors gradually slowed before the cabin door opened. One by one, the SEAL operators stepped onto the tarmac. The final person to emerge was Emily. She removed her flight helmet, thanked the crew chief for preparing the aircraft, and began walking toward the operations building with the same calm pace she had shown all morning. There were no dramatic speeches waiting for her. No cameras. No celebration. Commander Brooks met her just outside the entrance and extended his hand. Emily accepted it with a polite smile. "Outstanding work, Commander Carter," Brooks said sincerely. "You saved the mission." Emily shook her head gently. "The entire team saved the mission, sir. I simply flew them where they needed to go." Brooks smiled, realizing that her humility was every bit as genuine as her extraordinary skill. Watching her disappear into the building, he quietly understood why the military trusted people like Emily Carter with its most important missions. They never sought recognition. They simply accepted responsibility, completed the job, and allowed their actions to leave the lasting impression. The morning sun slowly broke through the fading clouds as normal activity returned to the base, yet the events of the night remained fresh in everyone's mind. Maintenance crews completed their inspections of Raven 1 while aviation officers finalized mission reports that would remain classified for years. Inside the operations center, Commander Brooks finished signing the last document before quietly closing the secure personnel file that had introduced him to Commander Emily Carter's remarkable career. Most of the pages would never be seen by the public, and many would remain hidden even from experienced officers, but one lesson required no security clearance to understand. Competence did not announce itself. It revealed itself when the moment demanded it. The young lieutenant who had mistaken Emily for administrative staff approached Brooks one final time. "Sir, may I ask you something?" Brooks nodded. "Go ahead." "Why did she never tell anyone who she was?" Brooks looked through the operations center window toward the now quiet flight line before answering. "Because real professionals do not spend their time convincing people they are qualified. They spend their time being prepared." The lieutenant reflected on those words before offering a respectful salute. "I will remember that, sir." A few minutes later, Emily quietly entered the room carrying nothing more than a small folder containing her temporary assignment paperwork. She placed it on the operations desk with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the entire mission. "My transfer documents," she said politely. "Everything has been completed." Brooks accepted the folder before extending his hand once more. "Thank you for everything you did." Emily returned the handshake with a warm but modest smile. "It was an honor to serve." Without another word, she picked up her travel bag and walked toward the exit. Conversations briefly stopped as she passed, not because anyone had been ordered to stand at attention, but because respect had naturally replaced every assumption made only hours before. Several technicians nodded politely. The maintenance chief offered a sincere smile. Even the young lieutenant who had handed her paperwork earlier simply stepped aside and said, "Safe travels, Commander." Emily thanked him and continued toward the morning light outside. Watching her leave, Brooks realized that the mission would eventually disappear into classified archives, the helicopter would return to its secure hangar, and the official reports would become little more than confidential records. Yet the people inside that operations center would remember something far more meaningful than technical procedures or successful timelines. They would remember the quiet woman who never demanded recognition, never corrected those who underestimated her, and never allowed pride to speak louder than responsibility. Long after Project Raven became another forgotten chapter of military history, the lesson from that extraordinary morning would remain with everyone who had witnessed it. Respect could never be forced through titles, uniforms, or reputation alone. It was earned through character, preparation, humility, and the willingness to step forward when everyone else believed there was no answer. Sometimes the strongest leader in the room was also the quietest, and sometimes the person nobody noticed at the beginning became the one nobody would ever forget. That morning, the SEAL team did not simply find the pilot they desperately needed. They discovered that true excellence rarely arrived looking for applause. It simply stood up when duty called, completed the mission, and quietly walked away, leaving everyone else wiser than they had been before.